Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Anyone got any spooky electronics stories? Particularly involving radio or analog electronics. 6 years ago. Be back home for summer vacation. 3 a.m., but I'm still awake because of a terrible college student summer sleep schedule. Decided to practice electric guitar. Don't want to bother anyone, so plug headphones into the amp. Take a break, but leave headphones and amp on while browsing on my phone. Suddenly, I hear a man's voice coming from the hiss of the amp through my headphones. Barely audible and sporadic. Turn volume to max. He says something, then pauses as if to wait for a response. Then continues talking. He's having a conversation with someone, but I can't hear who the other person is. Starts mentioning nearby street names, a cemetery, and a local Dunkin' Donuts. Eventually, he mentions the street I live on. I am freaked out. This continues for about 10 minutes, then suddenly stops. Spend the rest of the night laying awake listening to the hiss of static. Try again every night for a month, but it never happens again.
Maybe it was an auditory illusion.
The sounds were definitely real. Over the next few years, I concluded that it was picking up some sort of ham or CB radio, probably from a local trucker. I was talking to my engineer friend about it one day, and he mentioned that it may have had something to do with the fact that the cable connecting to my guitar was over 5 meters, so I had it coiled up on the floor. He says he's had problems in the past with coiled cables picking up all kinds of crazy interference.
When I was a kid, I had a cheap pair of walkie-talkies that used the same 2.4 gigahertz band as modern, 2001-ish cordless phones. It just intercepted everything. If my mom was on the phone, I could just turn on my walkie-talkie and could eavesdrop on everything. Same with the neighbors. Cordless phones just broadcasted everything unencrypted. The scary thing is that cell phone networks use much of the same technology. Anyone within several miles could be listening to your every conversation. SMS messages are also broadcast in plain text. Just imagine how everything you've said or texted over the years was not actually private.
Back in the mid-90s, pirate radio stations were still something that felt relatively countercultural, vested in the spirit of free music and information. It helped that the MCs who managed them were usually funnier and less dependent on silly sound effects than all the pinheads on WKL-FM or whatever it was my father listened to at the time. As a poor urban teen before the great rise of online piracy, getting a hold of music was difficult outside of the mysterious world of radio. Long after my parents were asleep, I would sneak into their car and tune into whatever pirate station was broadcasting at the time. This is how I was introduced to many bands who slipped under the radar of popular music. One day, I tuned into a station that held me in its grip for months to come. From the Bottom of the Night, World Receiver. This is how the station's broadcast started, usually a few minutes after midnight. Previous to that, there was only tape hiss and the sound of shuffling around. The introductory bit was narrated by a sedate male voice. It reminded me of an old educational film of the type you still got shown at school back then. Immediately after that, the sound started. World Receiver did not play songs, but rather let loose an elegant and unbroken stream of sound. It was made up entirely of samples put together haphazardly, with a lethargic beat keeping it together. Within the nooks and crannies of the dense soundscape that emanated from the station, you could make out bits and pieces of telephone conversations, clips from old movies, super slowed down riffs from 80s hits, and everything in between. Flies buzzing, mariachi serenades, babies laughing. It sounded like the world, condensed into a sound and regurgitated. It would continue to play for approximately 3 hours and then fade out, and the station would fall back into silence until the next night. My obsession with World Receiver became stronger with every night that I spent on the front seat of Dad's car, allowing myself to be mesmerized by the texture and sounds of the station. I would sit there and listen intently, though sometimes I would fall asleep. I remember my grades suffering thanks to this self-inflicted insomnia. Despite the eclectic nature of the broadcast, I began to notice recurring sonic elements in world receiver, aside from the more eclectic and sporadic ones. Basically, it started to sound more familiar. The sounds of my everyday life crept upon and began to dominate the sounds of the station. Bicycle bells rang, chalk softly scraped on a blackboard, the idle whispers of vacant students, all mixed into the sound and hard to discern. With each midnight listen, these changes became increasingly apparent. I remember telling a few friends about world receiver. Most of them were uninterested. Others tuned in once or twice and found it boring. About the only person who was as enraptured by the whole prospect as I was Anthony. We started to discuss the possible nature of the station and our favorite parts of the recordings with regularity, and it became sort of our secret thing. But it soon became apparent that we were not listening to the same music. On any given day when we discussed the previous night's broadcast, Anthony brought up sounds that were completely absent in my experience. Rattling chains, the soft crackle of a flame, the sound a car makes while driving over gravel, and periodic, high-pitched screams like tiny needles shot out of the sound. And he figured this was what I heard when I tuned in too. This is when we started recording world receiver. Back then, we were still using cassettes, and I had to borrow a friend's radio equipment to successfully record the station. I took it to my house, sat at the foot of my bed, antennas raised, and waited for the stroke of midnight. The announcer's comforting voice soon seeped in, and the 3-hour soundscape extravaganza began as it did every night. As per usual, I didn't hear any of the things that Anthony described, not the gnashing of teeth, the irritating buzz of mosquitoes as they fly towards and away from you at night, the thud of something heavy and hard being dropped on wooden floor. All of these he described in precise and anecdotal detail. I realized that I also made very specific associations to the sound in world receiver. It was probably because everything that came out sounded nostalgic, shot out of the core of someone's life, yours and everyone's. I successfully recorded that night's session onto the tape, and so did Anthony. The following day after school, we got together at his house and played the tapes for each other, huddled in his room with an even older and shittier box to work with. But it did its job. First, I put in my tape and pressed play. What came out was not what I had heard the previous night. When played out of the tape that I used, world receivers sounded like a recording of a recording of a recording, like a 7th-generation bootleg or something. It was extremely decayed beyond reason, considering it had been recorded just the previous night, and the sounds came out languid and covered in layers of static and breaks, choked out as soon as they were emitted. As the minutes advanced, it became exponentially worse. At the 10-minute mark, all we could hear was the squalid beat behind all the surface walls of sound, sinister and constant. But soon enough that died out too. We were left with nothing more than tape hiss. Trying to rewind and play the tape again resulted in nothing. I was more than a bit puzzled by the results, though Anthony figured that I probably had used really old or bad equipment or something of the like. He put in his own tape next, and was surprised when the exact same thing happened. The sound was decayed and gnawed away beyond recognition, and it was disintegrating more with every passing minute. Much like with mine, it fell apart completely a bit after 10 minutes, bearing the underlying beat as well. But it was not the same. Whatever it was Anthony had recorded the previous night, it was not what I had been hearing out of world receiver. It was similar in its liberal use of samples from all over the place, but different all the same. Anthony hadn't been lying about the things he heard in the broadcast. His version of world receiver sounded like a harsh and impenetrable industrial record, the opposite of the soft and flowing ambient I'd been hearing every night. There was heartless machinery revving up rhythmically. There was clanking and rips of static and waves of theremin screech. There were babies screaming and chains clanging and deep thuds. And the beat was not the same as mine. It was more urgent, more pointed, but also less constant, sometimes falling out like a broken snare drum. All in all, it was much more sinister. At this point, we started wondering if we were listening to different stations, because clearly we hadn't recorded the same thing at all from what little we'd heard of it before it was well apart. But we weren't, as far as we knew. And both of our recordings began with the world receiver introduction. It didn't seem likely that there were two such stations out there, And then there was the fact that the tapes had decayed so quickly. Examining the cassette later revealed that the equipment itself was fine, but the recording had disappeared completely and the tape was blank. It was as if World Receiver's sound could not be captured. It could only exist in the radio waves, emanating freely. Our discussions and experiments with World Receiver continued for several weeks. We tried recording it once again with better equipment, but the outcome was exactly the same. We tried to pinpoint the samples that we heard and trace them back to their origin. We thought we had a few nailed down sometimes, but in reality, there was no way to tell for sure. Everything was too distorted, sped up, slowed down. As the only two audio nerds in school, our discussions dominated all of our other interactions, and we stopped talking about everyday life altogether, preferring to take a stab at the enigma that was that radio station. Given that nobody else cared, nobody else understood what we were talking about. I also came to ignore Anthony's attitude towards everything else at the time. He had become quickly obsessed with the station even faster than I, and sometimes I think that he was even more engrossed by it, completely putting off schoolwork or his other friends in favor of discussing and staying up for the stroke of midnight. I don't think he missed a single session of World Receiver between the time he discovered it and the end of it all. And for those reasons, I also began to ignore his life beyond school, his appearing with occasional bruises or once a black eye. I would casually ask about it. He'd said he'd gotten into a fight, and that would be that. Though Anthony's interest in the station grew with every passing day, I was sort of growing out of it after a couple months of World Receiver. I think I was kind of burnt out of it all and talking about it all day. I wanted to see my other friends and do more normal things. Anthony had long since lost that perception, and only had ears for World Receivers and theories on its mysteries. But we had hit a brick wall. We couldn't record it. We couldn't determine where it was being broadcast from. We had no idea of how to triangulate a signal. And the sounds never really changed. They were constant for him and for me. The strange announcer's voice was the only hint that there was someone human operating the station, and beyond that, it didn't help at all. One day, Anthony didn't come to school. He stayed at home for the remainder of the week, and amongst my classmates there was some gossiping about how they were having family troubles, and his mom had apparently suffered a miscarriage late into pregnancy. I didn't even know they were expecting. Anthony never told me anything of the sort. He eventually re-emerged the following week, gaunt and tired, bruised and stricken by bouts of narcolepsy, as if his sleep schedule had shattered into dozens of naps taken over the course of the day so as to always allow him to tune into World Receiver. The others talked behind his back, but gave him a certain distance, acknowledging his grief, I suppose, and he only talked to me. The first day that he came back to school, he sat next to me during lunch and nonchalantly began to talk about World Receiver. He never brought up problems in his family, his feelings, his personal life, anything. I figured it would be inconvenient to mention them myself. Anthony said that World Receiver had changed for him once again. Now it was more focused, more zoomed in on him. He chalked this up to the fact that he tuned into the station every single night. At that point, I only did so sparingly. He pointed out that the superficial sounds, the more extravagant and esoteric ones, had disappeared, and now he only heard the arrhythmic snare at the heart of it all, with passing sounds and samples of muffled yelling, field recordings, the buzzing of electric porch light, the sounds of suburbia, as he called them. And his obsession didn't let up, of course. He started talking about how all his attempts to record World Receiver had failed, and how he was keeping a log of the sounds that he heard, and how they disappeared gradually with every night. At this point, I was a little disconcerted about Anthony's complete disregard for everyone and everything else and told him as such. First, I tried to bring up things other than World Receiver in conversation, as subtle as I could, but he would change the topic right back to World Receiver without even a casual remark. This continued for a few days until it made me angry. It frustrated me that I could no longer talk to him about anything. It angered me that he seemed to be a completely different person. And it infuriated me that he refused to take on his family situation head-on, taking refuge in some stupid, mysterious radio station. Of course, at the time, I was self-entitled and naive, like most teens, and told him as such. He just took it, staring at the floor, like a child being admonished. After a long pause, he said, "Okay," softly, as if apologizing. For a few days after that, we didn't talk, as it felt awkward. Others asked me about Anthony and whether he was okay. I shrugged and said that his family was going through a difficult time and that we should give him some space. Most everyone agreed. But without me, Anthony had nobody left to talk about. Nobody else wanted or cared to know about World Receiver after all, and that was all he had been reduced to discussing. Soon enough, I suppose he stopped seeing the point of coming to school and failed to show up for class. The faculty didn't really react. Anthony's death came as a shock to everyone in the school. A couple weeks after he stopped coming, we were notified that he had regrettably died in an accident. He had suffered an epileptic seizure and fallen off his house's second story, breaking his neck as a result, passed away that same night in the hospital. The more lurid details of his family life didn't surface until later, when they became the juiciest topic at school. Apparently, his father was a drunk and prone to abusing his family, and his mother wasn't much better, which caused the miscarriage in the same place. Apparently, the bruises and black eyes that Anthony showed up with every once in a while weren't the result of street fights. For God's sake, I didn't even know that he suffered from epilepsy. Nobody did. He had stopped being Anthony shortly after World Receiver, I guess. The whole thing was very tragic, and the grade was haunted by him for the remainder of our school life, to the point where there was a dedication for him during our graduation ceremony some years later. In reality, he didn't have many friends other than me, but everyone still felt bad. The school board launched an awareness campaign and so on. I didn't really know what to think. It was hard to feel immediately sad about Anthony being dead because, well, when you're a teenager, the idea that people really die and their lives end still feels foreign to you. Your entire life is ahead of you, and chances are that nobody close to you has died yet. Furthermore, with Anthony's case, my memories of him after World Receiver were completely different from those that came before. Before I told him about the station, he was a complete person, rounded out, with flaws and quirks, with reasons why he was my friend. After the fact, he had become a factoid dispensing machine, an audio tinkerer, a devotee of World Receiver to a degree where it had engulfed every other aspect of his humanity. In a sense, I had already felt separated from him for a long time, and the guilt and regret. Guilt for never wondering about his problems. Regret for telling him about World Receiver in the first place. Didn't overcome me after a week later or so. Then it hit me, and I cried and talked to people about it. And eventually I became normal again, freed from the grips of our strange mutual obsession. I remember that the day of Anthony's funeral, which I and practically the rest of our grade went to, I sat down in my dad's car, much like the very first time, to listen to the station, sort of in his memory. Soon enough, it was midnight, and I awaited anxiously for another broadcast. I felt a little scared. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I was aware of how monumentally this station had affected me in past months. But I had no time to think of such things, as the introduction came along, emanated sweetly from the radio crackle, from the bottom of the night, World Receiver. There were a few moments of silence, and then the music faded in. It was the same comfortable wash of sounds and samples that I had fallen in love with in the first place. But it only took me a few minutes to realize that some changes had taken place. I heard it in the background first, and had to strain my ear to notice the difference. Something pounding and hard. Little needles of static prodding the tunes. Vocal samples cut off awkwardly. The sound of cold machines in a factory, of fire, of engines revving, was slowly overtaking the broadcast. I sat there frozen with a strange mix of curiosity and fear. When the baby's piercing cry came in, I shut it off and jolted out of the car. I never listened to World Receiver again, nor have I really told anyone about it. To be honest, I've forgotten what station it was, and given that it was pirate radio, the police must have shut it down by now. Well, I don't really believe that. I'm sure that World Receiver is still broadcasting, and will continue to do so. It doesn't seem like it could possibly be any other way. It is constant and ever-changing, and impossible to capture, and I'm sure it will be there for me when the music stops.
I'm in the telecom biz as a radio frequency communication technician. I haven't seen anything weird, but know a guy who works for one of the major cell providers here where I live. One night while on call in 2012, he got a trouble ticket for a cell site on top of a local hill known as Little Mountain. He said he stepped outside to admire the clear night and was surprised to see a glowing sphere cruising silently above the treetops in the wide valley below him, and heading in a westerly direction towards a line of mountains known as Mount Arrowsmith. He stood there stunned, because he had a difficult time comprehending what he was seeing. The sighting lasted about a minute or more until the object was lost in the distance. His second one was on top of a mountain overlooking a lake west of the incident described above. Late afternoon, he was packing tools onto a quad preparing to seal up the comm shack when he heard something with weight behind it, sounding like it was walking on two legs just off in the tree line. The cell site is shared with other radio users and located in a clear cut. What creeped him out was every time he heard the noise and he stopped to listen to get a better bearing on it, it stopped too. That was his nope moment and he hurried out of there. I think he said that was in fall 2011. The area is known for a lot of Bach, local native name for Sasquatch, sightings and footprints.
So I never listened to the radio, but when I got off work an hour ago, my phone was dead. I drove home listening absent-mindedly to the radio and changed the station on accident. When I got home, I tried to find the station I liked before going inside, but along the way found a channel talking about being an oracle, the law of attraction, inner divinity, and general X stuff, so I listened. I should say I have always been spiritually attuned through dreams. When my ex was having demonic issues, I knew they were arriving because I'd see them enter the home disguised as her in dreams. That being said, when my grandpa died 3 years ago, I had no dreams related to the matter. I thought it was odd because my family seemed to have some minor paranormal occurrences, but my thing came up void. My grandma died last week and I was wondering if she'd come see me in a dream or anything similar, but nothing paranormal has happened. After a bit, they start talking about dreams and I think, maybe I should pay attention, there could be something relevant. The woman brings up what to do if you'd like to speak to a deceased relative. The only thing she said about dreams before moving on, I'm not even sure why she brought it up. It wasn't relevant. She explains that to do it you should for 10 minutes before bed, focus on a fond memory of the deceased, and sort of invite them or will them towards you. And to top it off, she even said, so say for example you wanted to speak to your Aunt Marie. She got the title wrong, but my grandma's name was Marie. What do you think, X, am I schizo? Or do you agree that I co-create with the universe and manifested an answer to my question about dreams, specifically related to my grandparent, by accidentally changing the radio station when I never listened to the radio, and she even said my grandma's name within the week of her death?
Hey there, /X/. I'm new here, so forgive me if I'm messing up some board etiquette or something. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and YouTube videos of /X/ readings, and it's made me want to share my story, if that's okay. I couldn't find a stories thread to post it in, so... A bit of a disclaimer, but I tend to write pretty wordy, so this could get long. Also, it's hard for me to tell whether most of the posts on here are people LARPing or actual schizos who believe what they're raving about. Most of the stuff in the videos I watch is definitely just some kids' creative writing homework. So, I know everybody says this, but my story is legit. Now, I don't have any proof, which in hindsight I did have ample opportunity to document, but didn't think I'd ever want to prove it to anyone. So because my story is legit, there are 2 caveats. For one, it requires some context or preamble to be even remotely interesting. And 2, it's anticlimactic. If you're still interested, then read on. So the background on me: mom's from Colorado, dad's from New England. Both, at least used to be, zealots. Homeschooled me because didn't want me to be influenced by all these immoral people these days. They followed some weird messianic religion, but for the most part I got a normal education at a conservative shul. This is actually relevant, I promise. Anyway, dad was kinda abusive when I was a kid. Eventually, mom and I decided to try and get away from his bull. She wants to go back home to Colorado to be with her old friends and family. I don't really want to go, but my options are to move in with her or stay with him, so fast forward 2 years, around 2016 or 17, and I'm 17 or 18 and needing it up in the desert. Now most people from elsewhere in the US, or at least at home back east, don't think about Colorado being a desert. So eastern Colorado is high plains desert where all the sorry poor bastards live. This is where my mom was from. Lots of Texans and other southern transplants moved in there. Lots of stars and bars, etc. Now this town in particular has been rumored to have some troubling history. From my mom's family I heard a bunch of stuff about the Italian mafia having been through there back in the day, and apparently at one point it was even a hotspot for fringe activity. Most of the land in the town is owned by a handful of families who have ran the place and had a hand in everything that goes on there since the town was founded in the mid to late 1800s, and they had to fight off the Cheyenne for the land. The place later on, sometime after the 20s I think, became a prison town, with like a dozen state-funded prisons, and that itself drew some weird people to the area, family of inmates and whatnot. Anyway, I'm tired and not organizing these posts very well. As I said, I was around 18 or so, and needing it up because I had no actual work experience due to working under the table most of my teens, and couldn't land a job in this dry backwater I found myself in. Now, I'm not exactly a radio friend, but I've always found them fun to play with despite not knowing much about them. As a kid, my dad always had one in his truck, and we put one in a few of my mom's cars as well, or carried a handset, which came in handy when caravanning on road trips or whatever. Sometimes, whenever we had to wait for something in the truck, he'd let me entertain myself by chatting with truckers. Well, at some point I think I came across one of those video essays on that Portal 2 ARG, and I decided that I wanted to try solving some of the puzzles myself. This led me down a rabbit hole learning about different software that Coomers were using to send porn over ham. Since I didn't have anything better to do, this inspired me to save up some of my tendies for an SDR card and pre-tuned antenna. I figured that I lived on one of like 3 major highways that cut through the Rockies, so there was bound to be a good amount of trucker chatter that I could have some fun listening in on. One day I get that in the mail from Amazon and very excitedly run through the setup only to find that for the most part I can't hear jack anything. I spent some hours scrolling through the frequencies, but for the most part, there were just the typical AM and FM stations and some encrypted beeps and boops over military frequencies, which wasn't too surprising since I was maybe 50 miles away from NORAD. I was pretty disappointed though, especially in the lack of CB traffic, and spent a good amount of time scrolling back and forth between those frequencies. Lots and lots of nothing. I suppose by then most truckers had already started doing more of their BSing on their cell phones, or maybe there just wasn't that many coming through. To be honest, there should have been something for me to listen to on ham frequencies, but I can't remember if either I didn't check them, or they were just dead as well. Could also be that my pre-tuned antenna wasn't set up properly or tuned great or something. Like I said, I don't know much about radios, so I give up and try again the next day. Lo and behold, after listening through all the CB frequencies with my squelch set to be noisy but not deafening, I start to hear some chatter coming through. It sounded like a deep male voice, but it was pretty faint and I couldn't make out what was being said. The voice was constantly broadcasting and was definitely speaking in some kind of rhythmic tone, which I thought was pretty odd. Usually it can be hard to zero in on a conversation because chatters only transmit occasionally for a couple second intervals. This was just a dude transmitting for minutes on end, constantly talking. It definitely confused me, but for the life of me I couldn't make anything out. So I eventually gave up, moved on to something else, and forgot about it for months. Now here's a second part of the story, which might be an aside but could possibly be related. I have no idea, you can be the judge. About 5 miles outside the town, there is a little canyon at the base of the mountains carved out by however many millions of years of runoff and stuff. I think some of the Cheyenne used to live down there, so you could go hunting for arrowheads and the like. There was also a bunch of geological stuff. You go hunt for fossils, dinosaur bones, footprints, etc. One day my mom proposes that we take a drive down there for a fun little day trip to get me out of the house. Fossils and Indian relics? Yeah, that sounds dope. However, There were also rumors among the townsfolk and my mom's family that there were some cultists who would go do rituals out there. Some of them said they'd seen it themselves. My dad had even told me as a kid that when he'd gone hiking back there at some point in the 90s, he'd found a bloody circle with a severed goat's head on the ground in a cave or alcove somewhere. Said he hated that place and used it as further proof that moving back to New England was a good idea, so we took a drive down into the canyon. Pretty cool stuff. Rough to climb even in our shitty spare Explorer, which we got as a backup vehicle kinda for this purpose. Turns out that instead of looking for cool artifacts and stuff, the park and trail mostly got used by teens looking to get drunk and out in the middle of nowhere. So instead of arrowheads and fossils, we found a lot of empty beer cans, graffiti, and cars abandoned down in the ditches and ravines. Like seriously, a lot of cars just left there because if they go off the road, no one can be bothered to get them back out. We were driving around and I found a little cave alcove thing. I've got my DSLR camera with me, so I tell Mom to stop so I can hop out and take some pictures. Pic related. Now again, me being a dumbass, I didn't take any pictures of this, but I found some small bones, skulls, and feathers arranged in and around the little alcove pictured. Down toward the bottom right, I think. Mostly just little stuff. Anything that would probably be easy to find if you looked for it while walking down one of the trails and keeping an eye out. I think most were avian skulls, maybe some rat or lizard bones or whatever. Nothing bigger than your fist. In addition to this, there were some Futhark symbols drawn in chalk on the clay wall above this little arrangement of macabre. I figured it was just the result of some bored goth scene chick looking to post something aesthetic on Insta or something, and didn't think too much into considering the state of what most of the rest of the area was in. I'm still pretty sure that that's what it was, and that it's irrelevant to the overall story, but I figured I'd include it anyway. Moving on, a few months go by and I get a job at Home Depot and make friends with a coworker there. Just a down-to-earth conservative dude, gave off the same kind of vibe a lot of people back home did. He and I start hanging out after work, and occasionally we take our guns up to the shooting range on our days off. Now that I've got a job, I'm still kind of poor though, because for the most part, I'm saving every penny I can to get the hell out of this arid hellhole and back to my pine trees. I happen to stop by at a mercantile at some point though, and find that they have a ton of old CB equipment. It was like $2 for a radio, and they were all untested, but why the hell not? Pick up 3 of them and test them out with a fuse adapter thing in the cigarette lighter of my car. 2 are blown, but 1's got life. Hell yeah. I convinced my mom to have Gramps install it in the Explorer since it's our emergency vehicle. Maybe a week or 2 later, a friend hits me up to go shooting again. During the drive up to the range, which is rather slow going, I remember that broadcast from a while back and start playing with the radio. I figure I'm going at least a little higher up. Maybe I could pick it up better from up here. No dice though, and I get to the range without hearing anything noteworthy. I give it a shot on the way back down though, because why not? Then, after scrolling through the channels for a bit, I hear it. Quite a bit clearer now, and this time instead of confusing, it's just kind of creepy. I don't get to listen for long though, as I'm headed back down from the range and back toward the town. I made a mental note to bring the SDR card and my notebook next time I came up to the range to see if I could better make out what was being said. Next time we go, I will bring it. Stop for a bit on the side of the road and scroll through the frequencies. Nothing. I did this on one more occasion without any luck before. Again, when going to leave the range, I picked it up on SDR sharp. I tell my buddy to head back down the plateau without me, that I planned on driving down into the canyon for a bit. And thus I began slowly making my way down into the canyon, crawling along while messing with the notebook in my passenger seat, and now and again stopping to get out move the antenna around on my roof. At this point is where my background comes in, and why I think it's not related to the bones I'd found there previously. The deep male voice, which I believe was probably pre-recorded and continuously transmitted, was speaking a good amount of gibberish that, even with a much cleaner signal, was hard to make intelligible. That was, however, until I started recognizing Hebrew numbers being read. The issue there is that the pronunciation was just bad. It sounded like whoever was prattling this stuff off couldn't read what they were saying, but wasn't instead transliterated into Latin characters, and they mispronounced some stuff with English phonetics. Just to give an example, although it's not a great one, Christians will say amen in English pronounced I-men, but in real Hebrew it's amen. Not the best example, but I'm not going to give a lecture on linguistics. So with this dude constantly transmitting, I got to listen to, I think, about 40 minutes worth of this broadcast. There were a lot of 42 repeated in there, which is an important number in Kabbalah occult stuff. There was also talk of Adonai, the universe, etc., most of which are words I recognized from prayers. However, there was probably a lot of stuff that I didn't recognize either from mispronunciation either on the reader's part or because I just don't know that much Hebrew. However, I do think there was something mixed in there that wasn't Hebrew though. Maybe Aramaic or Arabic, and none of it made any sense grammatically from a Hebrew perspective. It seemed like random words being thrown out there. It wouldn't form a cohesive sentence, and the guy was reciting all of this in the most monotone, emotionless voice, like a numbers station kind of vibe, if that makes sense. Except instead of numbers, it's just vague gibberish. So I'm trying to listen to this all the while winding my way down into the aforementioned canyon. I'm kinda starting to get stressed out at this point, because aside from the creepy radio voice, I've never gone down into the canyon by myself before. I wasn't used to driving those scuffed roads, and despite the Explorer having a pretty high suspension and doing my best to dodge around low and high areas, I kept bottoming out, and I was puckering up praying that I wouldn't get stuck, or end up going off the road and trapping myself. The farthest part of the park from the town, I think, was around 15 miles. That was definitely not a hike I wanted to make as dusk was approaching, and I had no water on me. Now this is where I started to notice that while winding my way along the road and zigzagging from east to west, that was a perceptible increase in signal whenever I rounded the north side of a hillock, and a decrease whenever I was driving along the south side. It was noticeable in my heat map as well. What I gained from this is that whoever was transmitting this was somewhere to my north or northwest. Best I can do here is a Google Maps snip of a section of the road. The red denotes where I think I remember the signal being hotter, and the blue colder. So the thing is, again, I don't know much about radio, but from my house to the range was about 5 miles. From the range to the furthest stretch of the road, pictured in the previous image and the bottom of the frame below, is another 7-ish miles, during which the signal strength more than doubled, but was still put off enough by having to travel through rock to be noticeable. This leads me to think that, situated on a high point, the transmitter could be anywhere in a range 15 to 20 miles northwest. Thing is, there's nothing there. Of course, I've brought this up to my co-worker buddy and my family. Of course, they were pretty nonplussed by it. Probably just some crazy hillbillies anon. But I mean, there's nothing up there. I mean, none of that is even accessible by car, and some of those ridges are hard to hike, let alone take an ATV up. And if this is pre-recorded, I doubt they're powering all this on batteries. They gotta have generators or some shit up there. And also just, why? I don't believe in the supernatural, but to me, some crazed rednecks having some whacked-out commune in the middle of nowhere in the Rockies is just as scary to me. I think this pic is from near the top of that north hill, looking out toward the northwest in the screenshot I scribbled on. I also hated how damn quiet the wilderness always was out there. The thin air just doesn't carry sound, and there's no birds or little woodland creatures to make noise. All you can hear is the wind. It's unnerving. Okay, here's the file. I'm tired though, putting my ass to bed. I'll check back in the morning to see if anybody's got any insight on what the hell that might be.
Would you consider going on a backpacking trip in that area? It would probably be a good idea to bring people you know and trust with you. If you brought recording equipment, you could share anything you find here. It would be a legendary thread if you did find something out there. By your description, there must be something out there.
I could, but I'm living back in New England now. I do plan on taking a trip back to visit at some point over the winter though. Like I said though, it's pretty rough terrain and there's nothing out there. Like I was a Boy Scout, and I'm not saying it can't be done, but having some dumb idiots inexperienced with mountain climbing disappearing up into the mountains to look for some hills, have eyes zealots probably isn't the best idea. Even if the cultists don't enjoy my liver with a side of Chianti and beans, I'm just as likely to go up against rattlers, scorpions, mountain cats, dehydration, etc. There would probably be actual climbing necessary, like rappelling with ropes and stuff, which I've never done before. To compound on that, I wouldn't know where to begin to look. The transmission point could have come from anywhere within a 10-mile square, depending on the transmitter power output of the transmitter, the elevation it was placed at, and its position among the surrounding rock. It seems like it would be near impossible to find anything, assuming there even is something up there, so I don't really plan on wasting my time.
Let me tell you something about CB. The range can be much greater than you think depending on conditions and transmit power. Oh, but CB is only 4 watts. Yeah, that's why they sell boosters. Technically illegal, but nobody cares. With a 4-watt Uniden 520XL and a K40 antenna, I was able to make crystal clear contact with a guy 85 miles away. Cold, dry weather. His base was on a mountain. My car was on top of another mountain, and nothing to block the radio waves standing between us. Then you have skip. This is when the waves bounce off the ionosphere, PIC related. I live in Canada, and I routinely hear transmissions from the southern US. Google Channel 6, Super Bowl, Skip Shooter, Motormouth Mall, etc. Lots of Spanish on Channel 9 also. These guys transmit with ungodly amounts of power. I'm talking tens of thousands of watts with tricked antennas and stacks of rack-mount audio processing gadgets. My homemade amp pushes 100 watts of unfiltered waves with a signal so dirty and full of harmonics you can actually hear me talking on a cordless phone. I can't even imagine the number of schizoid meltdowns I've caused by using that thing over the years.
I used to work as a broadcast technician with AM transmitters. One time we were doing some work on a transmitter. Now an AM site has something called phasers, which are circuits of giant ass, capacitors, and inductors with huge copper tubes as wires. And you run 100,000 kilowatts through it. When you run that much power through, the sound from the radio station actually comes out through the wiring, the copper tubes, as they vibrate in the air from like a shitload of energy. Basically, the phaser becomes like a very low fi speaker. So we're working late at night, it's 2 a.m. We don't want to interrupt the station because that causes problems with advertising. So we do all our work at night and I'm listening to the radio station through the phaser. I'm in this little wooden shack in the middle of a farmer's field alone at one tower, and my coworker is working at the other tower with the main control. At the agreed upon time, my coworker shuts the power off and it goes quiet. And then all of a sudden I start to hear whispering like a little girl that sounded really similar to the phaser radio station. As if the radio station was broadcasting a little girl speaking. But I know the power was out. Obviously that freaked me out. I tried to find the source of the voice, but it just kind of came from everywhere in the shack. And then it just kind of faded away, so I got back to work. When you pump that much energy through inductors, things get weird. I now think spirits can use it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.